It was said in London drawing-rooms that shame arrived quietly, not with raised voices but with lowered eyes, and Lady Eleanor Ashcombe learned this truth on a rain-softened afternoon beneath chandeliers blazing far too brightly for her comfort. She stood at the edge of a Mayfair salon, gloved hands folded with practiced elegance, while society appraised her as one might a delicate porcelain cup already showing hairline cracks. Conversations did not halt when she approached, they merely altered their tone, becoming gentler, more careful, and therefore more cruel. She was spoken of as fortunate, a word that hovered over her like a veil meant to conceal pity yet never quite succeeded. Eleanor had once believed herself invisible, and in happier years that invisibility had been a kindness. She was not the most dazzling debutante nor the most calculating, but she possessed a steady intelligence and a dignity shaped by restraint. Now invisibility deserted her. Her family's decline, once whispered discreetly, had become an open secret dressed in politeness. Ashcombe House stood still upon its hill, but its roofs leaked, its servants dwindled, and its accounts bled quietly. Eleanor knew this because she had watched her mother's letters grow shorter and her father's silences longer, each omission a confession no one dared name aloud. It was in such rooms, heavy with perfume and judgment, that Eleanor first heard the Duke of Harrington described without affection. His name travelled swiftly, as powerful men's names do, carried on admiration laced with fear. He was widowed, distant, and formidable, a duke whose presence chilled the air rather than warmed it. Some claimed he ruled his estates as he ruled Parliament allies, with precision and unyielding discipline. Others whispered darker things, though never loudly enough to be held accountable. Eleanor listened without comment, though each word pressed upon her chest with quiet inevitability. She understood before anyone told her that her future had narrowed to a single path. Marriage, once a possibility, had become a necessity sharpened by time. Her parents spoke gently, but their hope lay bare between every carefully chosen phrase. A match with Harrington would save the Ashcombe name from decay, restore its standing, and secure Eleanor's younger siblings against uncertainty. The cost of this salvation would be borne by her alone, and she accepted that truth with a calm born not of courage, but of habit. The Duke himself remained absent from these early discussions, which unsettled Eleanor more than overt scrutiny would have done. She saw his seal on letters, his signature precise and spare, yet no personal message accompanied them. It was as though the arrangement proceeded without any need for her presence at all. This omission fostered unease among the women who observed her, for cruelty was easier to understand than indifference. Eleanor, however, felt a strange and shameful relief. If he did not look at her, he could not despise her. When at last she saw him, it was at a formal dinner arranged to satisfy appearances rather than curiosity. Duke William Harrington entered the room with the economy of a man accustomed to being watched yet unwilling to perform. He was taller than she expected, his expression composed to the point of severity, dark eyes reflecting little beyond measured attention. He acknowledged Eleanor with a bow of exact propriety, neither lingering nor dismissive, and spoke to her with a courtesy so impersonal it bordered on reverence. In that moment, she felt less like a bride-to-be than a responsibility carefully acknowledged. Throughout the evening, Eleanor observed him as one studies a landscape rumored to be dangerous. He spoke sparingly, listened intently, and never once allowed conversation to drift into flirtation. Others deferred to him instinctively, adjusting themselves around his presence. Yet Eleanor noticed what society did not mention: the faint tension held in his shoulders, the way his hand stilled whenever his wedding was referenced, as though he braced himself against something unseen. It was not the bearing of a tyrant, she thought, but of a man bound tightly to duty. Still, reputation is a powerful sculptor, and Eleanor could not fully free herself from fear. Each night she imagined the life awaiting her, a grand house echoing with silence, a husband whose expectations she might never satisfy. She feared not violence, but erasure, the slow vanishing of self beneath the weight of obligation. To marry a duke was to surrender privacy, choice, and perhaps tenderness, all in exchange for security that did not belong solely to her. On the evening the contracts were finalized, Eleanor stood alone beside a tall window overlooking the street, watching carriages pass like indifferent witnesses. Voices murmured behind her. sealing her fate with satisfied approval. She felt no tears rise, no dramatic protest form, only a solemn acceptance edged with resolve. If she must enter this marriage as an offering, she would do so with her dignity intact, guarding it as fiercely as any dowry. Across the room, the Duke concluded his discussion with her father, and turned away without seeking Eleanor's gaze. The omission stung, though she could not say why. Yet as he departed, she sensed something unfinished lingering in the air, a question unspoken, a pause heavy with possibility. Society believed the story already written, cruel duke and frightened bride bound by necessity. Eleanor, standing very still, felt the first faint tremor of uncertainty ripple through that certainty, and it was enough to carry her forward into a future she neither desired nor fully understood. In the hush that followed his departure, Eleanor drew a slow breath and lifted her chin, aware that her life had been reduced to rumor and expectation, yet refusing to become either. She would be watched, weighed, and judged, but she would also observe in return. Somewhere within the rigid shape of duty, she sensed the outline of a choice yet unrealized, and though fear lingered, it no longer stood alone. The night settled, carrying her toward vows promised but not understood. The wedding took place beneath a sky of pale silver, as though even the heavens withheld enthusiasm for the union being solemnized below. London gathered in polished restraint, filling the cathedral with silk, murmurs, and the faint rustle of expectation, while Lady Eleanor Ashcombe advanced up the aisle with measured steps that concealed the tremor in her breath. She did not search for affection in the faces that turned toward her. She searched instead for composure within herself, knowing that composure would be the armor she wore henceforth. At the altar stood Duke William Harrington, immaculately composed, his expression unreadable, his attention fixed upon a point just beyond the ceremony itself. When their vows were spoken, they were exchanged with precision rather than warmth, and yet Eleanor sensed the gravity beneath his stillness, a seriousness that carried weight rather than indifference. The bells rang, triumphant and unquestioning, as society declared the matter settled, and with that sound Eleanor's former life folded itself neatly away. She became a duchess by title, by obligation, and by scrutiny, though the transformation brought no sudden elevation of spirit. At Harrington House, she was received with formal efficiency, servants bowing with practiced loyalty, the vast corridors echoing faintly with her steps. The Duke escorted her through the grand rooms, naming their functions with courteous brevity, never lingering, never presuming. It was clear that he wished her to understand the estate, not to impress her with it, and this distinction both steadied and unsettled her. Their early days followed a rhythm shaped by custom rather than inclination. Meals were taken with polite conversation, neither strained nor intimate, and evenings ended with mutual good nights delivered at a respectful distance. Eleanor occupied the chambers prepared for her with care, noting their thoughtful arrangement, the absence of excess, the quiet order imposed upon every detail. It was a household governed by discipline, yet not by cruelty, and she could not reconcile this reality with the monstrous reputation that had preceded her husband. Still, restraint itself could be a form of judgment, and she wondered whether his distance was chosen for her sake or his own. The first gift arrived without announcement, the long-neglected library reopened, its windows cleaned, its shelves restored, and a small writing desk placed beside the fire. No note accompanied this offering, nor any explanation, yet Eleanor understood at once that it was intended for her. She spent hours among the volumes, rediscovering solace in thought and learning, feeling for the first time since her engagement that some part of herself had been recognized. Gratitude stirred within her, tempered by uncertainty, for kindness unspoken can be as confusing as indifference. Society, however, was not content with quiet gestures. Invitations arrived swiftly, summoning the new duchess into public view, where curiosity sharpened into speculation. Eleanor attended with calm dignity, aware of the questions pressed into every glance. When the Duke accompanied her, he did so with impeccable propriety, offering his arm, addressing her with respect, yet never crossing the invisible boundary that separated courtesy from affection. Whispers followed them through ballrooms and drawing-rooms alike, wondering whether fear ruled their household or something more enigmatic. It was at one such gathering that the first true test emerged. A careless remark, spoken too loudly by a well-connected matron, suggested that Eleanor's position rested solely upon obedience rather than esteem. The insult was veiled, but unmistakable, and silence fell as listeners awaited the Duke's response. He did not raise his voice, nor did he display anger. Instead, he corrected the speaker with measured authority, defending his wife's character as one might defend a principle. The rebuke was brief, devastating in its calm, and afterward no one questioned Eleanor's standing again. That evening, as they rode home beneath a sky heavy with stars, Eleanor felt the ground shift subtly beneath her expectations. The Duke did not mention the incident, nor did he seek acknowledgment, but his presence beside her seemed altered, more resolute, less distant. She realized then that his power was not merely political, but moral, and that he wielded it sparingly. Yet this understanding brought new confusion, for gratitude deepened into something more perilous when mixed with hope. As days passed, further signs emerged, quiet yet deliberate. A portrait from his first marriage, once hidden away, was restored and rehung in a private gallery, its presence acknowledged without sentimentality. Eleanor recognized the gesture for what it was, an honest admission of the past rather than its erasure. The Duke spoke little of that former life, but he did not pretend it had never existed, and this candor invited trust even as it maintained distance. On the eve of their formal presentation at court, Eleanor prepared herself with careful deliberation. She understood the expectations attached to her role, the unspoken assumptions that would shape every judgment. When the Duke entered her sitting room to escort her, he paused, as though considering words left unsaid, then simply offered his arm. The moment held no romance, yet it carried significance, for it acknowledged partnership without presumption. Eleanor accepted, aware that the path before her remained uncertain, yet no longer entirely bleak. That night, as she stood alone before retiring, Eleanor reflected upon the balance between fear and dignity that governed her new life. The Duke remained an enigma, his kindness restrained, his intentions guarded, yet his actions contradicted the legend that surrounded him. Society waited eagerly for proof of failure or misery, but none was forthcoming. In the quiet of her chamber, Eleanor sensed that the true measure of their marriage had not yet been revealed, and that whatever lay ahead would demand courage of a different kind. With that knowledge, she extinguished the candle and prepared to meet a future shaped not solely by duty, but by questions still unanswered. Night fell upon Harrington House with a solemn quiet that seemed to press against the walls, as though the estate itself understood the significance of what was expected to occur within. Eleanor sat alone in her bedchamber, the fire reduced to a low, steady glow, her wedding gown replaced by simple white linen chosen not for allure but for propriety. Attendants had withdrawn with measured bows, leaving behind a silence heavy enough to feel deliberate. She folded her hands upon her lap, not in prayer, but in resolve, reminding herself that dignity was not something bestowed, but something defended. She had been taught, as all women of her station were, that this night marked the true beginning of marriage, though no one spoke of it without euphemism. Fear hovered at the edges of her thoughts, yet it was not fear of pain that unsettled her most. It was the fear of being reduced to a function, of discovering that her value ended where duty was fulfilled. She listened for footsteps beyond the door, her breath carefully controlled, her posture upright even in solitude, determined that no weakness would greet him first. When the door opened, it did so without ceremony. Duke William Harrington entered quietly, closing it behind him with deliberate care. He did not approach at once, nor did he assume familiarity. Instead, he remained near the threshold, as though uncertain whether to cross it. The firelight cast long shadows across his features, softening the severity Eleanor had come to associate with him, revealing a fatigue that spoke of restraint rather than cruelty. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence deepened, not with menace, but with consideration. Then he asked the question that would remain etched in Eleanor's memory long after the night itself had passed. "Are you afraid?" His voice was low, unadorned, and free of expectation. It was not the inquiry of a man asserting a right, but of one acknowledging another's humanity. Eleanor felt something loosen within her chest, though she did not allow it to show. She met his gaze steadily, weighing honesty against pride, and chose truth tempered by composure. "I am aware," she replied carefully, of what is required of us. It was not a direct answer, yet it was an invitation, and he accepted it with a slight inclination of his head. He moved closer then, not to the bed, but to the chair opposite her, seating himself as though entering a conversation rather than a claim. The gesture disarmed her more completely than any display of authority could have done. She realized with a sudden clarity that this moment would define not only their marriage, but her understanding of him. William spoke next, his words chosen with evident care. He told her of his first marriage, not as a tale of romance lost, but as a study in silence endured. Duty had governed that union as surely as it governed this one, and in his adherence to it, he had failed to see what was owed beyond obligation. Grief, when it came, had been sharp and unrelenting, teaching him that power exercised without tenderness could become a form of violence, even when no hand was raised. Eleanor listened without interruption, sensing that this confession was not offered lightly, nor repeated often. He admitted his fear as plainly as she had admitted her awareness. Fear of repeating harm, of mistaking restraint for virtue, of becoming the very monster society had named him. He said he would not cross the threshold of her consent without her willing word, that marriage, though sanctioned by law and custom, did not absolve him of responsibility. The declaration carried no flourish, no plea for gratitude, only a quiet resolve that demanded respect. Eleanor felt the weight of expectation shift, replaced by something unfamiliar and fragile: choice. She answered him not with passion, but with acknowledgement. She thanked him, not for his rank or his protection, but for his honesty, and in doing so, she recognized her own courage. The conversation that followed unfolded slowly, touching upon books, upon governance, upon the peculiar loneliness of public life. They spoke as equals, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease, discovering common ground neither had expected. The night advanced without urgency, its purpose transformed by mutual understanding rather than consummation. When at last he rose to leave, he did so without regret, pausing only to assure her that nothing had been lost by patience. Eleanor watched him go, aware that something far more valuable than expectation had been gained. Alone once more, she reflected upon the strange gentleness of the hour, upon the power of a question asked sincerely, and upon the quiet revolution it had ignited within her. Fear had not vanished, but it had been named, and in naming it, diminished. Sleep came slowly, carrying with it a sense of altered certainty. By morning, the world beyond her chamber would remain unchanged, society none the wiser. Yet Eleanor knew that the marriage everyone presumed to understand had begun on terms entirely its own. She rose with the dawn, steady and composed, aware that the path ahead would still demand resilience, but also aware that trust, once offered, could reshape destiny. Somewhere within the rigid architecture of duty, a door had opened, and she intended, in time, to walk through it. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet deliberation that surprised even those who lived within Harrington House. Eleanor moved through her days with a steadier step, no longer bracing herself for judgment at every turn, yet never forgetting the world beyond the estate gates. William observed her from a careful distance, not from disinterest but from discipline, as though he feared that haste might undo what patience had begun. Their conversations grew more frequent, shaped by candor rather than ceremony, and in them Eleanor discovered a mind sharpened by responsibility and softened by reflection. Society, however, was not inclined to allow such calm to persist untested. Rumors shifted, no longer focused on cruelty but on absence, questioning why the marriage did not display the expected signs of possession. Invitations multiplied, each one a stage upon which the Duchess was expected to perform happiness convincingly. Eleanor met these demands with poise, her confidence drawing subtle admiration, though whispers still traced her steps like shadows. William accompanied her when required, his presence a quiet shield, his silence a deliberate refusal to indulge speculation. The moment of open challenge arrived at a formal gathering hosted by a family long practiced in measuring power. There, amid gilded mirrors and polished smiles, an insinuation was offered under the guise of concern, suggesting that Eleanor's influence over her husband was insufficient, that her position lacked substance. The words were carefully chosen, meant to wound without consequence, and the room held its breath in anticipation. Eleanor felt the familiar heat of shame rise, yet she did not retreat. Before she could speak, William stepped forward, his voice even, his authority unmistakable. He did not defend her as one defends property, nor did he silence the insult through intimidation. Instead, he spoke of partnership, of respect earned and freely given, and in doing so reframed their marriage as a deliberate alliance rather than a transaction. His words carried weight precisely because they lacked excess, and when he finished, the matter was settled beyond appeal. Eleanor met his gaze then, gratitude and astonishment mingling within her, and in that exchange something unspoken was affirmed. Afterward, away from the assembled judgment of the world, they walked together through the gardens, the evening air cool and fragrant. Eleanor thanked him, though she understood that gratitude alone was insufficient to describe what she felt. William acknowledged her courage in standing firm, recognizing that dignity defended by oneself carried a strength no title could confer. They spoke then of choice, of the slow shaping of trust, and of the risks inherent in allowing affection to grow where duty once ruled alone. It was not a dramatic confession that followed, but a gradual recognition, marked by shared silences and unguarded laughter. William found himself seeking Eleanor's counsel, valuing her insight in matters both personal and political. Eleanor, in turn, began to anticipate his presence, not with apprehension but with warmth. The boundaries they had erected out of caution remained, yet they no longer felt like barriers, but like promises honored willingly. On a quiet evening, as rain traced delicate patterns against the windows, William spoke of love without naming it, describing instead the responsibility of cherishing what one has been entrusted with. Eleanor answered him in kind, speaking of courage found not in defiance, but in trust extended. Their hands brushed, briefly, deliberately, and neither withdrew. The gesture was small, yet it carried the significance of a vow freely renewed. When at last they chose to cross the final threshold together, it was with intention unmarred by fear. The union that followed was not born of expectation, but of understanding carefully cultivated. In the days that came after, the household sensed the change, though no announcement marked it. Eleanor's laughter came more readily, William's severity softened, and the harmony between them settled into the rhythms of daily life. Time, that relentless witness, bore quiet testimony to their transformation. The Duchess became known not for her compliance, but for her grace and discernment. The Duke, once feared, earned respect tempered with admiration. Together, they navigated a society quick to judge and slow to forget, yet no longer defined by its scrutiny. Their marriage, forged in restraint and strengthened by choice, stood as a quiet contradiction to the expectations that had shaped it. As Eleanor stood one morning upon the terrace, watching the light spread across the grounds, William joined her without ceremony. They shared the view in silence, content in companionship unmarked by obligation. In that stillness, Eleanor understood that love had arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a series of deliberate acts, each one chosen against the customs that had sought to deny it. The world would remember titles and alliances, but within Harrington House, a different legacy had taken root, one built upon respect, consent, and the courage to ask, and to answer, honestly.